I'm Weldy. I'm the senior advisor for a company named Vutility. Vutility makes these sensor devices, think of them as smart meters, but beyond that is simply clipping them on a wire, be able to monitor power, but not only that, get data analytics on how your systems are using power beyond just the power itself. And I'll use some examples and case studies for that. But my topic today is the significance of LoRaWAN in healthcare. So where is it at today? But before we move today and go forward, let's take a step back in time just a little bit. Let's go back to 2014. 2014, there was the Oscar event. The Oscar event was really what helped discover, and I think popularity started to rise rapidly for the selfie. I think many of you are probably taking some selfies while you're here, and that's when it kind of really started to happen, is in 2014. Or as you hear the music in the background, Interstellar. I think many of you may have seen that movie. Here's that music playing in the soundtrack background as well. A very neat sci-fi music that I think is helpful to see. I like this event horizon. The idea in that movie showing you what is the future going to be, what's it going to look like, where do we want to go, how is it going to change over time. And then there was my presentation back in 2014 where I talked about IoT systems in healthcare. I gave a presentation audience of folks that was looking at patient tracking, hand hygiene, asset tracking, all the things related to what we're talking about somewhat here today. But where are we that's different? I came from a very long time healthcare experience platform with a company called HCA, and I was with them for 26 years. And with them, I was doing some work with facility management, optimization, and technologies. A company like that was very fortunate. I was able to test a lot of technologies to use for IoT. And here we are today. So fast forward to where we are at this moment in time. And we are at a quantum leap with LoRaWAN. I hope that you all appreciate that. If I could do a selfie with the audience right now, we would have this moment in time of 2023 saying that LoRaWAN has really changed the IoT landscape for adoption, not only in healthcare, but for building and other assets. Let's talk about that here a little bit more. And I want to take you through a journey with a sort of a human anatomy analogy and use cases to how to look at where LoRaWAN is and how to think of that technology. Let's go in and take a look at actually the human body, the nervous system. So the CEO of Vutility, Stephen Prince, talks about that you can't change something until you understand it. You can't understand something until you see it. So how do we understand? How do we see? And a nervous system is an electrochemical process that happens in all of our bodies, and we have systems today to monitor brain waves, our EKG, our heartbeat. So if we think about we can do that with people, how can we do that with other applications in buildings as well? Or let's take a look at another healthcare application, and that is within looking at a person's eye. So in the human eye itself, you can see a lot of different things going on in the eye. So my son is a retina surgeon, and as an ophthalmologist, you can look in a person's eye and see a lot of illnesses and diseases through that. And I asked him, well, how many of those can you see? And he said, here, I'll send you a list. Here are a few of the things you can see just by looking to see through the eye and understand what is going on with a human. So I want to also take you to another sort of analogy here, and that is to think about what you can see and what you really can't see. So here we have a waterfall. It's from my home state in the States, in the state of Tennessee, where you're looking at a waterfall coming out of the side of a mountain, flowing down into a basin that just disappears. The water flows out. I can see it pouring out, but I don't know where it goes. So think of that analogy with power going into a building. We can see it through the utility meter, but what is happening? How is that power flowing through the facility over time? So let's think about buildings a little differently. Let's kind of almost think of them like I was using the human anatomy. Let's think of them as being sort of like this idea that buildings are sort of alive. So let's kind of go down that parallel track. So let's go ahead and jump inside the building, past the meter, and see what is going on inside the facility, and take a look at a couple of use case studies here. So the first place to think about is an operating room location. What is going on from a power perspective in operating room? A lot of times we can put a lot of sensors in to see that, but just looking at the electrical characteristic of the edge device that I just showed you from Vutility, we can measure a lot of different data points to see what's going on and do it at the edge, and then that information push out to your application to see it better. So as you think about an operating room, it's a very expensive space to operate. and it uses a lot of power utilities to run those operating rooms. If we can know best how their operating room is being used, we can optimize its power use. So if you think about these bands you see in front of here are actually the times that a surgical case is actually occurring, and then you can see the power use, power flow through the time in which they were using that power. So you can see when to turn systems down on standby and when to turn them back up just by looking at the power. Again, my point is I think we underestimate just the amount of data that can be collected from a power edge device. So let's look at another case study, and fast forward here to the area of elevators. In checking with national elevator companies, I asked them, do you monitor the power usage for your elevators? And the answer that I came back with was not very many said yes to that. So as you think about it, just like when we talked about putting an EKG to measure heart rate and all the heart dynamics that go on through the EKG process, think about doing the same sort of thing with elevators. If we can monitor the start, stop, the run time, all the aspects of looking at how the elevator performance works, we can then determine, okay, what is the optimum way to maintain them? I mean, sometimes in some areas of the country and the world, there are shortages of the technicians to maintain these systems. A lot of times in the elevator industry, in the lift industry, there may be a shortage of maintenance technicians. So you want to send them to work on the elevator to be the most productive. And here's an example by seeing how elevator loses. So this kind of almost looks like an EKG in a way of how elevators are using power. And from that, you become more predictive in your nature of what you're doing. Next up is the example is I'm going to talk about magnetic resonant imaging, MRI. And MRI is a very expensive piece of equipment and pretty sophisticated idea of how that works. Think about if you can monitor the power usage with an MRI, you can see what's going on. The green line below is actually when a patient is in, you can see when it's actually turned the machine on and off. So you can clearly see on the one side of the graph when their patient was in being scanned and when it was on standby, and then there was after hours. The steady line on top is the chiller that has to run to keep the liquid helium cool, to keep the magnet inside the MRI cool so it can be magnetic as it is. So the idea is to take this data back, and Intuitive MB was a good company that helped visualize this data coming from Vutility to see what's going on in this particular case. But what's interesting about that is you can go back to the manufacturers of this equipment and show them the power usage patterns that you may have much better than they have, and start to figure out is there ways to better optimize this equipment, and also help to have predictive maintenance I mentioned earlier. So I want to pivot my talk with my time remaining, because being in the buying business, I mean, I was a buyer for 26 years. Many of you out there are developing products and services to sell to others, or you're also wanting to understand how do I evaluate trade-offs to make a buyer's decision. I want to give you a framework to how to think about that, a framework that I've developed and thought about over the years to think about how do you think about managing the trade-offs of all the decisions that could be possibly made. So the first questions are always asked by the buyer is, or the seller has to understand, what is the job to be done and what is the problem to be solved? And the first, and I want to have you remember this acronym called FACES, F-A-C-E-S. There are 5 trade-offs. I'm going to walk you through each one of those, and then I'll put a bow around that here in a moment. So the first is the function. So as you think about what you are looking at or buying, what is the function, what is the purpose of it? Sometimes that's the context to the buyer. Contextually, what are you presenting? What's the problem to be solved? If the buyer cannot articulate it, it's up to the seller to help understand that. The second area to think about is the aesthetics of the solution. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's think about things that we buy. There's a lot more that goes into it that relates to our emotions. So think of aesthetics as sort of the conductor to the decision of the trade-off. So trade-off number 2 is aesthetics, the senses and emotions, the bias that people have, the form factor. If in IT, I would call it the UX, user experience. What is that like? What is the risk associated with it? Risk really is an emotional thing. Think about it. Risk is, well, how much risk am I willing to deal with? It's an emotional decision that has to be dealt with from a buyer perspective. And also agenda. Agenda is very important to understand, but example I want to give you is the hidden agenda. I think you're familiar with people that actually have hidden agendas, and that can be kind of difficult to try to unwind. Again, using a healthcare example, because that's what I'm talking with in that space, is I've noticed someone that's a pharmacist, and he had a patient call him up and ask him some health conditions that he had, some concerns he had. So he was dizzy, he was passing out, and I'll refer to my son now as the pharmacist. The pharmacist says, well, tell me what's going on, and he did, and he said, well, if you have any concerns, you need to go to the emergency room or see your doctor. So the guy said, no, I don't want to do that, and then he called back a second time that same day, and again a third time. My son went through his medication management and said, there's nothing more I can do for you, sir. Hung up. Next day, his wife calls. He says, well, my husband didn't tell you all the information that you needed to know. He said, the pharmacist said, what's that? Well, my husband actually took down a shot of whiskey and swallowed 2 Viagra tablets. Well, Viagra and alcohol together does what? Reduces blood pressure, passing out, having issues. And so as you think about that, that was a hidden agenda item that was not discussed with a person. So my point in all that is, when you think about hidden agendas, it's important to know that from aesthetics. So aesthetics is the conductor. Third area is costs. When you think of costs, people always ask, how much does it cost, right? How much does it cost? That's a trade-off, right? Think of cost as the referee. And the refereeing decision, the 5 trade-offs, cost is refereeing kind of that decision that's going to be made. The fourth area is efficiency. As we're looking at trade-offs, we're looking at how efficient is this? This would be the user interface, the UI experience. So what are you doing with, what does this product do to make things more productive? Industrial engineers would say that if you want to increase throughput, you do 2 things. The first thing you do is reduce the number of steps, and you reduce the variation. If you do those 2 things together, you begin to increase throughput efficiency. Finally is the sustainability of the final 5th trade-off category is sustainability. And that is dealing with reliability now and in the future. But also I would say it deals with environmental response as well, because it's dealing with energy efficiency, all the aspects of what the IoT technology platform will give you as far as the trade-offs is concerned. Let me leave you with a real example. I can talk about all these 5 areas. Again, just remember the word FACES, those 5 areas: function, aesthetic, cost, efficiency, sustainability. And then go on to, 1 second there. Okay. Go on to thinking about when you think of LoRaWAN, what are the 5 trade-offs for LoRaWAN? And I grabbed these from the benefits of different things that I was able to pull together to bring this to where it's at. So I would say that it's a wireless LoRaWAN is used to connect sensors to an application. Is that the case? That's what its function is. That's its context. Pretty straightforward, right? But what are the aesthetics of LoRaWAN? And that is, again, the risk factor, end-to-end security, certification, growing ecosystem, public and private deployment. So what's the story there? The second is on cost. So it's first cost and lifecycle costs that buyers have, and how does that look at starting small and ramping up to a large way of spending the money. Then there's the efficiency part of it, output compared to input, and they say firmware updates over the air, lower bandwidth costs, all the things that are advantages to efficiency. And then finally, the sustainability, longer battery life, augmented with other sensors that can be used, augmented with sensors with self-powering technology, deep indoor penetration. You get the picture. I say all that because it's important to understand when you have a product or service you're selling, what are my 5 trade-off categories, and how am I articulating those sort of things to the potential customer, and then also what are sort of the myth busters you need to tell them about to get the conversation going quickly. So with my time remaining, also the things that I've noticed in my career is that sales are faster for things that are de-risk compared to those that bring opportunity. Think about it. If you come to somebody with an opportunity, they're going to want what? A business case, pro forma, all the issues that have to be discussed can take weeks and weeks and weeks to get that all worked out through an, quote, opportunity. But when you're de-risking a situation or emergency, those decisions are quick. I've made $1 million decisions within 5 minutes, and maybe take a long time to make a $100,000 decision for an opportunity. Be specific, start small, and build credibility. So I want to leave us with this, the time remaining. If I could do it, I don't know if it'd almost be like the 2014 Oscars, we do a selfie to remember this day. So remember 2023 is LoRaWAN's seminal event to where it really exploded in adoption in our communities. Thank you. And my appreciation to the AV guys, because they were put that music in the background very last minute for Interstellar, so that was impressive. That was on the fly, which a lot of what we do is on the fly, isn't it? So, any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks. You mentioned that de-risking is better for use cases, sorry, for business cases than opportunities. Would you have an example or something concrete that, just to kind of give a sense of that?
For example, hospitals require emergency power, and if they lose power at all, then their operations will cease. So let's say in the case of in Florida, there's a hurricane, and the hurricane is coming, they'll roll in portable generators to hook them up and have them ready for the event. So those things, that's a de-risking activity. So anytime there's a de-risking, dealing with emergency, those decisions get made much faster than, what about this opportunity that we've thought about? And if you've been through the experience, you know opportunities can take weeks and weeks and months for people to make a decision. Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it. Thank you.